science at the Johan.
Sorry about that. Okay,
The
keep going.
Johan Skytte Institute of Political Studies, which is at the University of Tartu in Estonia. And actually, I first became acquainted with Natalia's work when she presented at the virtual Young Scholars Conference that the Wisconsin Russia Project sponsored in, I guess it was January 2021. It was virtual at the time. The world has changed a lot since that time, as we all know. You know, Natalia presented about gender movements, gender-based movements at the time of the conference, and she continues to conduct work on that topic. In fact, that's the topic of her dissertation project, which is titled "Gaining Voice: Feminist Grassroots Mobilizations in Putin's Russia." And she already has 2 master's degrees, one in political science from the Central European University, one in international relations from Higher School of Economics. And she's also volunteered herself for a number of organizations, including the Sakharov Centre, the EU-Russia Civil Society Forum, the German-Russian Exchange, and also Transparency International Russia. So we're very fortunate to have her here all the way from Estonia. And her talk today is entitled, I think, Between Horror and Hope, Feminist Anti-War Resistance and Opportunities for Mobilization in and Outside of Putin's Russia. So let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you very much, Ted and Jennifer, for this very nice introduction. And thank you for inviting me to speak here, finally. I made it to Madison as noticed today because I've been planning to come here already for quite some time. And today's talk is going to be about my dissertation project on which I'm working since the beginning of 2019, basically, once I started writing my research proposal for my PhD program. And at that point of time, when I was especially applying with my topic, which you heard about, like the title, at that point of time, the topic seemed quite marginal to many people, to many professors. It was actually really hard to find supervisor back the days. But then over the years, and especially with the start of the Russian scale invasion and the emergence of feminist anti-war resistance, about which I'm going to talk the topic has become more and more important, and actually is the topic attracts many people. So many people are interested in what is going on right now in the Russian civil society, but at the same time, the first time that there is a very vibrant, a very big feminist community in Russia. And I'm happy to share today results of my research and also some of the preliminary results of the interviews that we have been conducting and still conducting with the feminist anti-war resistance activists around the world. So I will start with this slide where you can see some of the pictures of the recent protests that took place in Russia. And since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine on February 24, 2022, the Russian feminist grassroots immediately reacted to this event by condemning Russia's actions and joined their forces to protest against the war, both inside and outside of Russia. So on February 25th, next day after the start of the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russian feminist activists that were mostly based already outside of Russia and were mostly they're studying at foreign universities or doing some activities in NGOs outside of Russia, they united against the occupation and war in Ukraine and published the anti-war manifesto in Jacobin magazine with a strong message. Over the past 10 years, the feminist movement has gained enormous media and cultural power. It is time to turn it into political power. We are the opposition to war, patriarchy, authoritarianism, and militarism. We are the future that will prevail. The manifesto announced the establishment of the feminist anti-war resistance, and here you can also see like the logo in the colors of the Ukrainian flag. So the manifesto announced the establishment of this movement outlined the anti-military and anti-Putin agenda of the Russian feminist grassroots movement and called for international feminist movements to join the anti-war protest actions worldwide. So as of today, as you can also see from the slide, they were able to attract supporters, members, participants, and volunteers, not just inside of Russia, but also outside of Russia, from more than 95 Russian and international cities. So currently the Telegram channel has more than 36 subscribers, which doesn't mean that all of them are active participants of the movement. Some of them are just following the movement. Some of them are also researching the movement. Some of them are just interested to read the materials that they provide on their Telegram channel, or some other channels that they use, including Facebook, Instagram, and some Russian social media as well, Contact or Odnoklassniki. So yes, and now they have cells not just in Russia, but also worldwide. For example, in Italy, France, Latvia, Estonia, Sweden, here in the United States. Yesterday, I've heard from my friend Lera that they even have their cell here in Madison. Yes, so if you would like to join them, just try to find them on Instagram. So yeah, and after more than 1 year and a half, Russia and Ukraine, feminist grassroots activists has gained even more visibility and recognizability in the public discourse. So the next slide, I would like to show you some of their repertoires that they're using to protest against the war. And these are like pictures of them publishing anti-war messages on the coins and just spreading them inside of Russia, which has become one of those creative tactics that they come up with in this very hostile political environment in which they had to operate in the context of growing repressions against anti-war activists and in general against any kind of oppositional activists. Oppositional means to regime, to Putin's regime. And also here, some of them have been going to the streets of Russian cities and trying to protest, also using very creative messages and constantly adapting their protest tactics to this changing political environment. So they have been also installing art objects in the parks, and I will show you some of their pictures of those art objects that they have been using. Wearing all black in public as a sign of mourning for the victims of Russia's war in Ukraine, handing out flowers to people and saying some anti-war messages or providing information about the war in Ukraine, or simply crying in the Moscow metro. So yeah, and with my today's talk, I would like to answer to this set of questions, which are like, I didn't want to make it like a very academic, but I think it's still important to keep in mind this question. So why was this kind of feminist resistance even possible in such a hostile political environment within Russia? And later we will also see at the level of repressions that have been preceding the emergence of feminist anti-war resistance and the level of repressions, growing repressions that has started since the start of Russia's full-scale invasion. What kind of opportunities they had before the Russian invasion? How do they organize nowadays? What are the strategies and tactics both inside and outside of Russia that they use? And what are the opportunity structures are available for feminist anti-war resistance? How do they influence the various aspects of their mobilizations? And for this also, just very briefly, I would like to mention that I'm relying on the concept of political, discursive, digital or technological mediation opportunity structures that are widely used in the social movements literature. And in general, my dissertation is basically trying to be at the intersection of gender studies, of social movement studies, of course, area studies. And in my dissertation, in my work, I'm trying to use both, also because of the critique of the political opportunity structure that has been developed over the last couple of decades. I'm trying to use both the perceived or subjectivist notion of opportunity structures, which means that basically we ask the activists, what does it mean? Like, not like I'm asking them, what is the political opportunity structure, but basically about the conditions in which they have to operate, whether, for example, they have political allies, whether they have access to the political system, how many opportunities do they see there. Then as for the discursive opportunity structure, usually we understand the access to the media channels, to traditional media channels such as TV channels or newspapers. And in my dissertation, I'm also trying to ask the activists of feminist anti-war resistance and also feminist grassroots in Russia, how much of the access, whether they're invited, for example, to give a talk, an interview in the media channels, so on and so forth. And digital opportunity structure, which means access to the internet, access to the social media, and also we consider the repressions on the social media. And I'm sure you know that the repressions are also present in the Russian social media, especially the government-owned ones. So yes, and also in my research, in some of the articles, I'm trying to look at other factors that have been also defining the feminist grassroots activism in the Russian feminist movement. So, and political opportunities is not probably the best explanation for this. That's why I'm also trying to combine them with digital and discursive opportunities. But also in one of my papers, I'm looking at the level of urbanization and how it influences the activists' motivations to be involved in activism and the opportunities that they have in those urbanized areas. So yeah, and another important concept that I'm using, and that is also very interesting in the case of the Russian feminist movement, interesting to apply, is the political invisibility, because like relying on the studies that have been done by Gala Cruz, for example, studies of women's movement in Argentina, in Yugoslavia, sometimes the political invisibility of those groups, of marginalized groups such as women or LGBT groups and so on and so forth, sometimes it creates positive outcomes for the mobilizations and creates a space for protest and resistance. And sometimes these movements, this marginalized movement, they actually use this as an instrument to escape political repressions. And you also see that in the case of Russian feminist movement, and how it basically helped the Russian feminist movement to survive this continuous cycles of repressions in Russia. So yes, and I have one slide about my data and methods, because I think it's very important also like to let you know on what kind of data my research is based. So I have collected, and now I'm still collecting this second round of semi-structured interviews with the feminist activists. The first round was from January to December 2021. And I managed to conduct 22 semi-structured online interviews. Why online? It's because I'm not myself eligible to travel to Russia due to also the potential of political repressions, and because the organizations in which I have been either having internship or volunteering, and also for the safety of my participants that I have been interviewing in Russia. And also, since you know Russia is so huge, it would be problematic to travel to many different Russian regions. And the online format actually gave me the possibility to interview activists, basically starting from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok, from many Russian regions. So at least 13 regions were involved into this first initial round of the interviews. And which is also demonstrating the regional activism is often neglected in the literature that is already written. There is a lot already written on the feminist communities or LGBT plus communities in Russia, but the research is most based on the activist experience in such metropolitan cities as Moscow or St. Petersburg. So there's also a lot of data which is available online, like online interviews of some of the activists. Of course, there's also like a problem that these are mostly the interviews of the most publicly visible feminist activists. Some of them are currently feminist celebrities of the Russian feminist scene. So, but it's still a very good resource for using in my analysis. And then I also conducted the online ethnographic observation of the feminist online communities, which actually also gives a lot of information about what they do, and also helps us to at least estimate the scope of the feminist movement in Russia. So, and for research in Vkontakte, for example, I managed to identify at least 98 feminist grassroots communities in Russia. And with this, we can actually say that it's been there, it's existent, it's been developing, and some of the Russian cities and towns even have several feminist communities that differ from each other and differ from the agenda that they try to promote. And currently we are conducting a new round of interviews. I'm saying we, because it's a team which is from different universities, including University of Helsinki, Indiana University. And we are actually trying to get at least 80 interviews. So like this was our initial goal. And now we are like almost done with this number. And we're interviewing mostly feminist anti-war resistance activists, volunteers, or supporters of this movement, or also women involved in the anti-war activism. So this new round is actually very important because it also helps us to grasp the experiences of feminist activists who had to flee Russia due to increased repressions. And we are also doing the online ethnography of feminist anti-war resistance social media and following other online discussions that are important to our topic. So yes, and now I'd like to just give you some of their information about how the feminist grassroots community in Russia before the emergence of the feminist anti-war resistance looked like. And I think it's very important to understand the character and dynamic of this feminist grassroots community, because then it's easier to understand the processes that are happening right now with the feminist anti-war resistance, and also to answer the first question that I posed, why was it even possible? So in Russia, before February 24th, a feminist grassroots community was a grassroots network of loosely connected individuals and groups identifying as feminists, maintaining contact with each other. So this network, as a researcher, scholar Vanya Solovey writes, this network consists of informal, unstable collectives that are easily dissolved and reemerge in new constellations. So it was very vibrant, not homogeneous, very heterogeneous at the same time. And the community was full of individual activists, artists, researchers, their groups and networks have a critical stance towards gender and other discriminations. And one of the things that they had been using a lot was discursive politics and activism that involved writing, publishing text in various genres, engaging in face-to-face and online discussions, as well as various artistic tools, including visual arts, poetry, theater, and music. And many of these tactics we will see today on the example of the feminist anti-war resistance. They're using it a lot in their public protests, in their activities, and they use the experience of previous generations of feminist movement for their inspiration. And here you can see some of the citations from my first round of interviews with the feminist activists when I asked them, what does doing feminist activism means to you? So for some of them, it was not going to the protests, not engaging in some political activity. It was more about organization of communities, finding people who think and want to develop in this direction, and create some kind of safe space. So it was more about like creating safe space, which was lacking basically, especially in the Russian regions, because maybe you know, but feminism, the word and term feminism, for a long time, it had very negative connotation in the Russian society. So this group of people wanted to just create the safe space and get to know other people who share the same values. Yes, and another group of activists was actually thinking about the street activism, which was more political, and it was very important for them. And they were thinking that feminism is not so much about some personal comfort that I achieve thanks to feminism. It's not about my well-being. This is a political movement for the rights of all women, about what we think about all women, not just about our girlfriends, about our circle, which are roughly speaking various white heterosexual women. So they wanted to gain more political freedoms in the Russian society. And this was actually from one of the regional feminist activists from a national republic. So there had been also pointed out that it's also not just for the women's rights, but also for the rights of ethnic and national minorities in Russia. And the feminist movement also has to promote this agenda. So continuing with the preconditions for feminist anti-war resistance emergence, in general, over the last 2 decades of Putin's rule, we have been observing patriarchal culture and traditional understanding of gender roles, increasing homophobia and misogyny that was present in the Russian society. And even Valerie Schelling was noticing that the Russian authorities use the gender norms and sexualization as a form of political legitimacy and opportunity, and they basically continue doing that. But the overall general context, both political and social, was not very good, so to speak, for the emergence of a strong feminist grassroots movement. And the more or less active women's movement appeared in Russia only at the beginning of the 90s, with the establishment of gender centers, with 2 forums in Duma, and increased role of women in the NGO and civil society in Russia, NGO sector and civil society in Russia. So overall, the interviews that I've conducted during the first round state that and conclude that there was a lack of political, discursive, and digital opportunities for feminist grassroots mobilizations in Russia, and increased levels of threats of various nature for them. So continuing with the political and lack of political opportunities, what do they mean by that? They meant basically the lack of potential allies among the Russian elites, weak influence of civil society, organizations on politics, low chances for women to win the elections. In their interviews, when I asked them, but look, we have some of the female politicians in Russian State Duma, for example, they were saying to me that the majority of those female politicians were prone to adopt the neoconservative values of political parties that they represented, for example, United Russia. And the feminists themselves, the feminist community, has decided, for example, in 2011 and 2015, that Yelena Mizulina and Valentina Matvienko, who were at that time parliamentarians in the Russian State Duma, were recognized as sexists of the year. Yes. And then there were also some of their political parties that have been also promoting, at least, you know, on the level of discourse, women's agenda and women's rights. But these parties also have adopted the neoconservative discourse and didn't position themselves as feminist parties. So if you go to the website of one of those parties, you can clearly see that we are not a feminist party. This is what is written on their website. Also, the activists mentioned that they lacked the allies among Russian non-systemic opposition parties. And also, there was a party, Yabloko, that had a gendered faction inside this party. But the activists, the grassroots activists, also reported that they have never really liked the Yabloko party, to be honest. Because also this party subverted the agenda. For example, there was a case when Yabloko party, the gender faction of it, held the Feminist Grassroots Moscow to organize and authorize the protest, because in Russia, in order to have a big protest, they have to authorize it with the authorities. So they got this authorization. And what happened next day, the day of the protest, this feminist grassroots came to this protest with their placards, with their banners, and then some of their members of this political party, Yabloko, also came to that protest with their big, huge flags and basically hijacked the protest. And next day in the media, there was nothing about the feminist protest, but there was like a short mention of the Yabloko party protest that was happening in Moscow on that day. So yes, and regarding their discursive opportunity structures, activists also mentioned limited amount of these discursive opportunities. Also, because the traditional media channels, especially the state-owned ones, were not interested in the feminist agenda themselves, and also in the feminist claims. And some of these groups, especially in the Russian regions, preferred not to have this public visibility recognized due to the high risk of potential threats. Also, some of the groups were so small that people thought that they're easily recognizable and that they might have some provocators coming to the events, or the police also disrupting their activities. So, next. Oh. Yeah. As for the discursive opportunity structure, we have been observing actually a better picture compared to previous types of opportunity structures. And as I claim also in one of my papers, the digital opportunity structure has been playing a major role in basically sustaining feminist networks inside of Russia and helping them to develop these cell organizations around the country. And here you can also see the development of this digital feminism, feminist activists in Russia, starting from early 2000s when they started to write and publish messages on Live Journal. And this was one of the main platforms for the grassroots feminism, for the identity building purposes, connection and education. And it actually started, which is like an interesting fact, with the Russian-Ukrainian Live Journal page. So it was both published in Russian and Ukrainian, which was like also interesting case. With the development of digital technologies in Russia and the wide access of the internet in the Russian regions, some of the groups decided that they have to have their own website pages where they have been also publishing information about the events that they have been holding, or some protest actions that they wanted to organize, or just sharing some feminist readings, feminist resources. Sometimes they also translated some literature from English to Russian, and they have been sharing it with the wider community of feminist activists in Russia. With the emergence of Kontakte, which is basically a Russian version of Facebook, many groups shifted to Kontakte because of its infrastructure, which was more user-friendly, because you could also post some music, some video materials, and you could share it free. So, which was also one of their factors why they preferred contact you over Facebook or over other channels like YouTube, for example. But also in Contact, you can share messages, write messages, share some books, and so on and so forth. So it had many opportunities and possibilities for the feminist community. So with the emergence of Contact, many regional groups also started to create their own pages and also connect among each other. Then they also, because of the social media trends, they switched to Instagram and Telegram channels while still having active pages. And nowadays they're also doing YouTube channels, podcasts, which is like a very widespread form nowadays of media in Russia. Websites, and even using TikToks for making educational videos about feminism. And it is especially good for younger generations of Russians that are, for example, still in Russia and don't have VPN and don't have access to Instagram or Facebook. So these digital platforms, they served as online platforms for organizing educational events, creating feminist discussion hubs, sharing knowledge, and academic articles, and were means of connection, especially considering the distance in Russia. Not every activist from, for example, Dubai region could go to Moscow conferences every now and then. So this was playing a major role in basically sustaining the feminist community in Russia and developing it. So some of the data that I wanted to show you, as I mentioned, I managed to find 98 existing communities before the Russian full-scale invasion in 45 Russian regions. Of course, including Moscow and St. Petersburg, but also there were communities, as I already mentioned, in some cities or towns, there were like several communities, or there were like some online communities that were all Russian, uniting all these umbrella organizations in Russia. So yes, and communities had different claims. So mostly they shared the agenda about the domestic violence law, which was one of the most important messages of the feminist movement before the start of the Russian war in Ukraine, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Then promoting gender equality in Russia. Some of the regional groups were also trying to develop their own regional agenda by, for example, posting some histories of feminists or female leaders in their home towns and home regions. And since February 24, of course, some of these communities preferred to switch their agenda and started to post more messages and more do more activities against the war in Ukraine. And as you can also see, the geography covers basically all Russian regions from Kaliningrad to Vladivostok. But as I already mentioned, these communities exist in more urbanized areas. So basically in the capital of the regions where they appeared, or in some other big cities or towns of these regions. So before the invasion, the feminist grassroots community basically has become an all Russian movement and was represented not only by capital cities, but regions that are located far from Moscow and St. Petersburg. And as I already mentioned, communities differed in types. So there was one type of communities that was created for educational purposes, and they didn't have political goals, as much of political goals. They wanted to create this love-like, safe environment and just maybe read some feminist books or just talk about the issues and inequalities that they face in their daily life. Second type of community was for the creation of purposes and the provision of supportive and safe environments, but also organization of protest actions, as well as educational events and festivals, which were usually publicly available to the wider audiences. That's why these communities and the activists who have been involved in these communities have been telling me during the interviews the stories of some provocators coming and disrupting, and how they actually had to deal with the Russian police. And the third type of communities is the most radical one. So the members of these groups openly support radical feminist values and leftist ideas and advocate for the eradication of patriarchy in Russia. And they all operated online as an online group, for example, in Kentucky, and offline community, basically having meetings about which no one knew except for the members of this community. So here you can also see like all these online communities that I managed to find, and you can read. They have very interesting names. Some of them have names after the regions in which they exist and in which they operate. Some of them just say that we are voice of women, and they don't want to call themselves as feminists. So yes, and they vary in the level of their activities. Some of them have been posting basically on a daily basis. Some of them were not active for 2 months, and also in the number of activists that have been involved in these groups. And some of the communities also, because of the security concerns, have decided that they have to make their communities closed from the wider audiences, and they have been basically checking every member who tried to join this community. But I will go better right now, and I would like to show you, demonstrate you the map as well, which is also very beautiful to see so many feminist grassroots communities that have been operating for the start of the Russian history of Ukraine in Russia. So here, basically, if you know the Russian geography, you can recognize that these are mostly the capital cities of Russian regions, and you can see that it's spreads around Russia. And then the next map that I would like to show you is basically confirming my argument that the feminist anti-war resistance was inspired a lot by the previous generations of feminist movements, but also have been using the infrastructure that the previous, not the previous generations, but the previous feminists in the previous decades have been building for the last basically 3 decades of their existence. And this is a map that maps that have been published by the feminist anti-war resistance, and they published this map themselves. So I'm not like uncovering like the feminist cells, but this is the information that have been provided by the official channel of feminist anti-war resistance. So here you can also see that it's basically similar geography of feminist anti-war resistance cell. So basically, and also in the interviews, it was confirmed that some of the current feminist anti-war resistance activists have been already in the feminist grassroots organizations of some type. So yes. So and of course, if we would like to know about the preconditions, there were threats, and I will not like stop for a long time here, but these threats are usually defined in structural movements which has constraints or unfavorable conditions, and they have also been influencing feminist activists in terms of whether they have to protest, what kind of repressions they might face for their protest. And these threats, as was mentioned by the feminist activists, involved all these different laws that have been passed. So mostly they were like paying attention to the new restrictive laws that have been somehow limiting their activism. And also there were repressions on contacted that they have been using a lot. So they were also scared of this potential persecution for example, likes, reposts, or just posts, or the potential of them publishing so-called extremist content, and no one knows what it means, like in the interpretation of the Russian authorities. So any kind of message basically could be interpreted as an extremist message, especially nowadays when they heard of this, that the Russian authorities want to recognize feminist movement in Russia as an extremist movement. So yes. So, and of course, there was also, there were repressions on Telegram that have been used mostly for their internal communications. But I will go further and talk about the level of repressions that have been, it has started after the start of the Russian full-scale invasion, which also influenced the feminist anti-war resistance activists. That's why you saw these pictures of people writing anti-war messages on coins or protesting with some messages from the Bible instead of directly talking about the war in Ukraine. So the level of repressions, as you know, has increased in Russia February 24th. And a lot of activists, including the activists that I interview right now, had to flee Russia and find new ways, strategies and tactics for their activism, and constantly adapt these tactics to the changing environment. And here I also wanted to share some data from UW-Madison. If you know, UW-Madison is collecting this data on a monthly basis about the number of detentions in Russia and in general political repressions and political persecutions. So here you can also see this wonderful number of people being repressed for their anti-war stances, and feminist activists are also included in this number. So it's almost 20,000 people that have been repressed in Russia since the start of the Russian invasion. And right now we have 813 total number of criminal cases against anti-war dissidents in Russia. And yeah, also just a picture of number of detentions. So the majority of those detentions happened during the first months of the war. And yes, and here is also some information about the restrictive laws that have been introduced in Russia since the start of the full-scale invasion. And these laws, of course, as also was covered during the interviews, have influenced the feminist grassroots activism in Russia and feminist anti-war resistance, because right now these activists have to be very careful in what they say and what they write, especially those activists who, for example, think about the ways of protest inside of Russia, so they don't put in danger those activists who are still operating inside of Russia. And today, maybe some of you heard the news that Sasha Skytte, who is also a feminist, she's not affiliated with the feminist anti-war resistance, but she is a feminist herself, also a LGBT+ activist. She was sentenced to 7 years of imprisonment by the Russian authorities. For her anti-war messages, she was changing the price tags in the Russian grocery stores, basically, and informing Russian citizens about the invasion of Ukraine. So if you would like, and here I'm also speaking not just as an academic, but also as an activist, if you would like, please send her letters. It's possible to do. You can Google it and see, and write her letters of support for activism. So yes, and I already showed you, demonstrated you this map, that beautiful map that we have of the feminist anti-war resistance operating in Russia, but also outside of Russia. And here's what they do. So try to summarize their activities. So here you can also see some of their screenshots shots from their Telegram channel, and see how many directions of work they have. And they also publish some of the manifest here and some of the materials for distribution inside and outside of Russia, like anti-war slogans, emblems, and so on and so forth. And basically, they do four main directions of work, which include legal support on labor issues for those Russians who don't want to work inside of Russia and, for example, at the factories or other institutions that are supporting the war or helping to produce some facilities for the war for the Russian army as well. They also have a psychological direction which helps both the activists inside and outside of Russia, but also sometimes nowadays also help the mothers of the mobilized Russian soldiers because they also consider that it's part of their work, and they help them with psychological and legal assistance in order to get their sons back from the war, especially in such cases when they're like forcibly mobilized to go to Ukraine and fight in Ukraine. So they also do assistance to Ukrainian refugees inside of Russia, those ones who were deported by the Russian authorities to Russian territories, or voluntary migrants. They also help with the evacuation from the country, from Russia, and they do anti-war media and try to develop anti-war community. And the media part includes both they spread decolonial messages. They fight Russian propaganda everywhere, basically. And some of the cells that I interviewed were based in Tallinn, and they're trying to, for example, fight the effects of Russian propaganda by working with the local Russian-speaking community that for many decades, instead of like, for example, watching Estonian TV, because in Estonia they also have Russian-speaking channels, they have been watching the first or second Russian TV channel. And nowadays, feminist resistance also thinks that it's part of their jobs, especially those cells that are based in the countries with a lot of Russian speakers have been brainwashed for decades. So yes, and they try to also do the anti-war social networks by contacting and basically doing joint projects with other anti-war initiatives, both Russian ones, the initiatives that are based inside and outside of Russia, but also the anti-war initiatives of the hostile countries in which they operate. And they produce a newspaper, and I will show you in a minute this wonderful newspaper that they produce. So about their structures, basically they claim that they are a very horizontal network of activists inside and outside of Russia. They do have coordinators of local branches. They do have volunteers that join the movement, and they have to share the values of feminist anti-war resistance. They mostly help with the professional skills. They have activists that are engaged in anti-war actions. They have cell activists also. So this is how we also distinguish between these different positions that they have. So yes, and so they both operate online and offline. And online, as they said, they have millions of those chats that they use on a regular basis. So digital means are also playing a major role in sustaining this movement, and basically helping this movement to operate, not just because of the repressions from the Russian authorities, but also because they're so dispersed around the world. Somehow they have to connect. And how do they take decisions in this organization is that they have regular calls on a weekly basis. Usually they discuss, for example, the strategy or like the repertoire of next protest action that they would like to organize. They discuss the security concerns. And for this, they have different protocols that they have been creating. since the emergence of this organization. And they decide on consensus about this, basic consensus on this, whether, like, what kind of action they have to take, when do they have to do, and what kind of security issues they have to think about as well. So since its emergence, the movement has been growing and also developing its structure. And here you can also see, I don't know why laser. So the funny quote from one of their activists is just, yes, FAR is an organization that was born in the situation of burning us. And for a very long time, we worked spontaneously and energetically. Then it became clear that without rules, regulations, it's difficult, and because of the high pace, it's not easy for new people to get involved. So basically, they have been developing this movement from scratch, structuring it somehow, developing these different roles, and then also protocols about security, making significant decisions, how to involve new people into the activism, and so on and so forth. And here I would like to show you some of their informative actions that they have been doing inside of Russia, and also outside of Russia, but mostly this type of repertoire that they have been using was prepared for the Russian context. So police couldn't just come and, you know, take you for expressing anti-war position, anti-war stances. So here is the Women in Black protest action that was inspired also by the previous generations of feminists or feminist women that had been protesting against war in Yugoslavia, Israel, for example. And since, let's say, on the board of this feminist anti-war resistance, there are historians and also people who are working in academia. They were aware of these protest tactics, and they have been reading more and more, and also sharing information about this historical women's anti-war protests, and trying to use their tactics and strategies in their own activism in Russia, inside of Russia. Then another protest action that took place is basically installing these crosses in the yards of Russian cities and towns, in order to demonstrate the Russian population that there was war happening, and also to commemorate the victims of Russian aggression by basically bringing war to the Russian yards. That was the initial message of this protest action. And another thing that they're doing is a wonderful newspaper that they're using for offline purposes again, and for the context of Russia. It's basically, they decided to create this new newspaper, which is very stylized and very similar to the Soviet newspapers that were popular among the moms and grandmothers of these activists, among this generation of Russian women. So they post anti-war messages in this newspaper. They also share some information about women's rights, feminist movement. They also put some anecdotes, some recipes of food. So, and as they say, this newspaper was a big success, especially among the older generations of Russian women. They have been reading it. They have been also changing their minds inside of Russia, and they have been like basically happy to get this newspaper on a monthly basis. Usually they do it. They produce this newspaper twice a week, and yeah, the activists themselves here, you can see the citation, what they said about the security concerns. They also don't want that this newspaper is causing some problems for the activists in Russia, and they ask basically the activists to be careful and not to distribute this propaganda, they call anti-propaganda materials, in the entrances of the houses. So here is also another thing that they do, but this is mostly for their online activism inside of Russian social media, such as, for example, Kontakte or Odnoklassniki. And since it's still like part of this anti-Russian propaganda fight of feminist anti-war resistance, they have been creating these anti-war postcards that are stylized in a way that usually people like use these postcards in Russia with this similar like style to congratulate somebody with something. So they have been using this style of these postcards, but they have been changing the message. Like, for the Easter, for example, instead of Christos, they basically wrote "Vatiania," of the war, enough of war. And for the Victory Day, they had been sharing this poem that was written by Daria Sienko, a very prominent feminist activist and also a public figure, like who is representing feminist anti-war resistance almost everywhere. So, and here you can also read this message. So, stand up, children, with the letter Z. There is no better letter in wall, drawn with blood, of swastika of victories. Have we won? Well, we were sent to be killed. Well, that's the order. If they will say us, we will kill you too. That is, of course, better than life. Light, of course, is worse than darkness. Happy Victory Day, all passes, but now we are passes. And of course, as I already mentioned, the big direction of feminist anti-war resistance is working with the decolonial agenda of the Russian Federation, because you know Russia consists not only of Russians but many other minorities that are living in ethnic regions or national republics, and I'm myself an ethnic minority, which is Polypermex minority. So FAS activists consider that it's also important to spread the decolonial messages to the wider audiences and also fight against Russian colonialism and imperialism. And it all started with the manifest of national minorities representatives who have been saying once the war started, that we non-Russians living in Russia look at this and feel as if we are in an upside down world. And they had also a lot of negative emotions about their existing empire and existing colonialism inside of Russia. So I'll also read this message that was published by the Feminist Anti-War Resistance that they had been collecting basically this messages from people who were following or subscribed to Feminist Anti-War Resistance channels. And one of the persons shared that the hatred of imperial culture towards those suppressed by it has not gone away. And until we are as a society learn not to look away but to suppress her expressions, until we achieve the restoration of the rights of conquered cultures, their languages, and heritage, until we redistribute resources from the Russian metropolis to the lands and soul, then this will continue. So basically, the message is that this is like a vicious cycle of Russian imperialism that this feminist resistance activists are also trying to fight against the discrimination of different minorities and nationalities inside of Russia. And also, I'd like to mention another project which is doing like this decolonial projects in cooperation with the feminist anti-war resistance. This project is Feminist Translocalities, which was actually started, if I'm not mistaken, in 2017 in Berlin by one of my friends. And it was trying to unite feminist activists from Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and also give more platforms for feminist activists from those countries. And yes, the next one, I already mentioned that Feminist Center for Resistance is operating outside of Russia in more than 20 countries. And one of the main tasks of these foreign cells is to carry out actions that cannot be done in Russia. And it's also for the connection of those activists who stayed in Russia and who escaped Russia. And also these activists want to speak on behalf of, not just speak on behalf of the immigrant community in a particular country, but they become heralds of the anti-war movement from Russia in the countries where they have cells. Another important thing which was mentioned during the interview is also that the political or social or gendered specific context of those hosting countries, for example, Armenia or Georgia, sometimes does influence the strategies and tactics the feminist anti-resistance activists have to choose. And sometimes it's not possible in some of the countries to even go out to the protest action. That's why they have to do, let's say, online activism and do some kind of closed meetings with the activists who are supporting. But also we see in general with throughout this 1.5 years of Russian full-scale invasion and the existence of feminist resistance, is that it was very important for the Russian feminist community and for the development of the agency of the feminist grassroots movement in Russia, and their self-awareness that they can actually become a political force in the future. And as one of the activists said, that we didn't see ourselves as a political force before, but now we realized our potential. And also feminist activists, since they were claiming that the violence that was blossoming inside of Russia might at some point spill over to neighboring countries. They have been saying this message on and off, and then after the start of the Russian full-scale invasion, they were going to other oppositional communities and basically saying, you see, we were right and you didn't hear us. And by this, they also recognize that they have more power and more truth in the claims that they have been trying to spread and the agenda that they have been trying to spread throughout the last decades. Yes, and FOSS thus has played a very important role in the awareness of the Russian in the self-awareness of the Russian feminist community, and basically raising the confidence in their own eyes. But as I already mentioned, the Russian authorities were very angry about the feminist anti-war resistance and about what feminist anti-war resistance does. So in November 2022, they faced another cycle of repressions. They were recognized as foreign agents. And then in April, as I already mentioned, they even, one of the deputies wanted to make a lot all the feminists in Russia as extremists. So, and yeah, this is the quotation from this weird deputy. Our feminists are simply agents of the West. They are engaged in the destruction of traditional values. Nobody knows what it means, but yeah. Their activities contradict the presidential decree on the support of traditional values. They advocate divorce, childlessness, abortion. They act against the demographic policy of the Russian Federation, which is probably very important right now for the Russian authorities. So many men are dying right now in Ukraine. So yeah. But also, as the last part of my talk today, I wanted to mention that, of course, there is a lot of criticism of this community coming from other feminist grassroots communities, especially those ones who are staying inside of Russia. And a lot of disagreements in this community. There is also this divide between those who left and those who stayed. And a lot of negativity from those who are still in Russia towards those who are outside of Russia, going to, for example, some conferences to represent feminists for resistance. And those who stay in Russia, they say usually that, oh, you're wearing your white clothes, going to nice conferences, drinking your wine somewhere in Armenia, while here in Russia we have to suffer and face the real repressions and arrests for our activism. Yes, and some of their members have been also condemning feminists for resistance for the lack of security. And there was a case of sisters Grigoriev when also this discussion was again started by this critiques of the feminism for resistance. Some of the activists that I also interviewed, they were claiming that FAR is more about anti-war activism than feminism. And initially, these activists were expecting that it's going to be more feminist movement and less of the anti-war movement. And also some of the activists were not, didn't like the fact that feminist anti-war resistance openly supported the position of Ukrainian feminists that Ukrainian military forces have to fight against Russia. And there is no peace between Ukraine and Russia on the Russian conditions. And some of the feminist anti-war resistance activists have been also promoting this message that people have to donate to the Ukrainian armed forces. So this was also criticized heavily by some of the members that initially joined feminist anti-war resistance, but then had to step outside of this movement. Yeah, and this is also a quote, despite this criticism, despite these allegations, and despite all the strife or framework that is still happening, especially in the Russian social media, it's still good for the Russian feminist community. And it helps to develop the discussion and improve a lot of things that are there. So I think I would like to stop here right now, and I would like to hear your questions or comments. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sorry I was a bit late. Yeah, thanks.
Okay, so we have a little bit of time for some